You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Today we're back with Dr. Benjamin Noonan. We want to encourage you on studying the biblical languages, and especially Hebrew. All right, with that background of Semitics and the culture that's going on with biblical Hebrew, there's such a distance between that and now, and so many people are intimidated and study the biblical languages, but especially in biblical Hebrew. I've seen some statistics, about people taking courses, about attrition after they've taken the courses. That maybe 99% tend to lose their Hebrew, at least of pastors, compared to 90%, which is still pretty bad for Greek.
Yeah,
but still 10% and 1%. What do you think about Hebrew pedagogy, and are there some considerations that you have for that? Because obviously you want to see people love and learn Hebrew.
Right. Yeah, and I see that same struggle in a lot of my students. I mean, even starting off, and this is a way in which Hebrew and Greek are different, I suppose, because the Hebrew alphabet looks very different. Greek, at least a lot of the letters look familiar to many students, but even starting right away, students often struggle with the alphabet. So I see the struggle because Hebrew is just very different, and languages are challenging to learn. Most of us, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so I want to do what I can to help my students learn the best that they can. And part of that entails using more communicative approaches. That's not the way that I learned Hebrew or Greek myself. I learned the traditional grammar translation method. And there's still a lot that's good in those methods. I mean, paradigms have their place. I'm not trying to say we need to jettison that at all. But when we take a look at second language acquisition research and we think about how do people learn languages, the way that they learn them is, again, using more of this communicative approach. My eyes have been opened to this a lot by my wife, Dr. Jennifer Noonan. Really thankful for her, and she's been a good partner to have on this journey of learning myself. But yeah, try to do what I can, and I take small steps. I can't do it all, again, because this is not the way I was trained. I'm not as comfortable. I need to build up my confidence and my own comfortability there. One example of something I did recently, Jen and I actually worked on together, were some short stories in simplified Hebrew, just giving our students a chance to get more practice with reading and to get some input where they're having a chance to read Hebrew and again, what second language acquisition researchers call input, where it's helping to reinforce their understanding of the language is just so key. And it's been great to see the results with my students too.
That's neat. How many years have you been teaching Hebrew then? So you've been here 10 years?
Yeah, I've been here about 10 years. I did probably about 8 years or so. I was doing first year Hebrew when I first came here. I have a new colleague here for the past 2 years, Dr. Michael Lyons, really grateful for him. And since he came, I switched to doing second year Hebrew, which is a little bit of a different animal, right? A little bit different when it comes to teaching. But you can still incorporate a lot of those same principles, trying to get your students into the text as much as possible and giving them opportunities to practice reading rather than just expecting them to memorize something and to be able to read it because they have learned a paradigm.
Right. So they get to see some of the payoff kind of early. Some of us have been in programs at times where it was almost like the text was withheld from us until we, went through the boot camp of the paradigm memorization and everything else, and just kind of like showed that we were worthy.
Right.
Yeah, and it was very discouraging at times.
It is. Yeah. You really need, with language learning, because again, it's tough. Yeah. It's hard. It takes work. And if you don't have that fun aspect to it, if you don't have the payoff that you can see, you're not going to have the motivation to continue. And I think, you mentioned stats at the beginning of how many people stop using the languages afterwards. I think a lot of it is because Well, maybe they didn't quite get to the level where they felt comfortable with it, but they didn't see the motivation. They weren't able to work with it quite the way that they hoped to, and that just gets discouraging and prevents people from using it afterwards.
Right. Well, I'm really glad that you are promoting their study and also looking at ways to improve the connection with the students and what they're going to retain. And that CIU also prizes including the biblical languages and keeping this as a mainstay in the curriculum.
Yeah, I'm thankful for that. I know not every institution has the languages as part of their curriculum, but CIU does, and I'm thankful for that. And I'm thankful for the opportunity, again, just even to do stuff like the Seder that we did yesterday, some of these extracurricular things which even contribute to our learning of the languages.
Right.
They're important.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned your wife, Dr. Jennifer Noonan.
Yes.
You all have collaborated with a journal article too, I believe, haven't you, with Paul Overland on the teaching of Hebrew.
Yep. Yeah, a little review of sorts of his. He's got his own grammar out, which has a lot of strengths and a lot of good things in it. We reviewed it at a session at SBL, also part of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew, one of their sessions a number of years ago. And so that's been fun to work with Jen on a number of projects. And we're always talking about ideas. We've got really interesting dinner conversations, and but yeah, she's helped me a lot just in terms of my thinking about how do we teach the biblical languages.
Right. Well, I think that's really neat that you've got the scholarly under the hood grammatical loan words and these types of interests, but also the very practical. How do we get first year students to start acquiring the language? That's wonderful.
Yeah.
When it comes to just sort of go-to tools for you, whether as a scholar, teacher, things that maybe you recommend people, you really need to have these kind of things in your toolbox or on your shelf. Would you like to share any ideas about those sorts of resources?
Yeah, I suppose part of it depends on where your viewers are at in their study of Hebrew. For students who have made it through at least the first year of Hebrew, one great book that I definitely recommend, this is my favorite of the grammars, is a Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar. This is just a great resource, partially because it's written very well. It's pretty clear and concise. It doesn't have, lengthy discussions, but it's very insightful, very accurate. And going back to talking about linguistics, it's really informed by modern linguistics. So this is my favorite grammar, kind of my go-to that I'll use. And speaking of linguistics, I also really like the Encyclopedia of Hebrew Language and Linguistics that Brill published.
Yes.
Now it's kind of expensive.
Yes.
But it's a good investment, and you can wait for it to be on sale.
Yes.
And then you can get it, and it's just got so many good articles in there. I refer to that as well.
I was really excited to see that Accordance Bible Software recently released, and the sale as of this recording is not on, but get on the newsletter. They come back around.
That's right, at least once a year or so, and it's a fabulous resource to have. I got it myself recently as well, so I've been thankful for that. I think another great resource that your viewers should check out if they haven't already is actually two, but they're related. They're similar. So there's Aleph with Beth and Alpha with Angela. They're two freely available video courses, I suppose you could call them, on Hebrew and on Greek. And they're for people of all different levels of language ability, whether you're just starting out or maybe you've known Hebrew or Greek for years. There's something you can learn there. I love their videos, which again are free, but they adopt more of this communicative approach. Really helps you to internalize things and to learn things in a way that you wouldn't otherwise.
One of the really neat perks of their approach too is it's all based in the target language that you're seeking to learn. So if maybe you're watching this and you're not a native English speaker, that doesn't matter for Aleph with Beth or Alpha with Angela. It's just going to lead you step by step into Hebrew or Greek from the first episodes.
Right. You're not having to translate it through another language, but you're able to learn it and to internalize it directly from the source language there.
It took me so long in my biblical language studies to start being able to think, and I still want to go deeper with that, but it's such a wonderful turn to make when you can go from having to think, I've got to translate this every time I look at it, to actually just trying to process it in that language. And those sorts of things help people do that.
Oh yeah,
from the start.
definitely,
right?
definitely. I mean, even our daughter Katie, she's watched a number of the videos for both, and it was amazing to see just how quickly she picked up the languages. Now, kids learn a little bit quicker than adults do, right? But even still, to see her knowledge and her ability to read Hebrew is amazing. So they're really effective videos.
Right, and that's probably without any homework or formal.
That's right.
study.
Yeah, just kind of watching the videos. Yeah, yeah, it's great.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, those are some great recommendations. I hope you will check into those if you haven't already. Well, what about some things on the horizon? We talked about some of the work you've done in the past, what you're doing now, some things that you recommend that are currently available. Are there some resources that you say this is on the way, or this looks like this is going to be a good thing in development that you want to just mention?
Well, maybe a few things come to mind. I mean, I'm really excited. We were talking before about the interest in discourse analysis, and it's been great to see a lot of resources come out there. And I think Dallas International University is going to continue to do conferences as they can. So that's great. I'm also excited to see podcasts like my wife's and yours.
SLA Insights with Jennifer Noonan.
Exactly. Yeah. To see people being interested in how can we learn the biblical languages and what's the best way to do that, what's the best way to teach them. I've been really excited by those kinds of developments, and I just anticipate, Jen and you and various others continuing to put out lots of good material there. So I'm excited about that. On a very different note, another project I've been involved in, I'm part of a research group called Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch. And we have a resource which is going to be coming out at least within a few years. It's going to be a textbook called Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch.
Okay.
Textbook that'll be for upper level undergrads as well as grad students. But just looking at the composition of the Pentateuch, trying to look at, for one thing, what does the Pentateuch itself say about its own composition, but try to take into consideration literary analysis, genre analysis. How did writing work in the ancient world? Also linguistics, which we've been talking about. I'm really excited about this project. It's going to be helpful to have a resource out there which will put forth a constructive model for the Pentateuch and its composition that's not just perpetuating the source critical status quo that we seem to have.
Right. That seems to be something that at least some generations of biblical scholars just took for granted. They said, this has been established by these scholars, solidified in the late 19th century and proceeding as if it's some sort of settled science that they then work from. Is that fair?
Yeah. And even for some people still today.
Yes.
But I think there's a growing dissatisfaction that kind of model, that approach just doesn't quite work. And it doesn't work with the way that ancient Near Eastern literature works based on our study of that. And we're imposing something foreign on it.
Right.
We need to take what the Bible says seriously, but again, also what the way that ancient Near Eastern literature works.
Right, and we can't assume that Greco-Roman concerns or certainly modern Western English composition rules and things like that apply in those cultures. Right?
Exactly, exactly.
We fundamentally misunderstand them.
Exactly.
But you can't just knock down something. You're talking about not just showing this is inadequate, but saying, here is a model that could explain better.
Right. And that's one of the advantages of this project, because again, typically it's been, well, we don't like what source criticism is doing because of this reason. This presupposition or this argument that's being made is not correct or not a good one. Well, I mean, that's helpful, but then we also need to have a constructive model. Well, how should we think about it then if we're not doing it this particular way?
Do some of these concerns also go back to what your Dr. Fotter said about, was it that the text has to make sense? Yeah,
exactly. Again, we have to read it as ancient Near Eastern literature, and it has to make sense. And if we don't think that, if we're not approaching it from that perspective, then we're going to miss things, and we're not going to understand it the way it was meant to be understood.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who did you say that was with?
It should be with Hendrickson. Yeah.
Hendrickson.
So hopefully your viewers can be watching for that in a few years.
Okay, excellent. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today, Ben. It's just been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks. That'd be great, Doug. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
You're welcome. As we close, would you like to speak to students, Hebrew teachers, researchers, any words of wisdom that you give to folks?
Uh-huh. You know, if you're first starting off in the biblical languages, one good thing to keep in mind is that it is so worth it to study them, both Hebrew and Greek, and do both languages if you can, if you have opportunity. But it's worth it. It's a lot of work, but the more you do it, the easier it will get, and the payoff is more than worth it. So please stick with it, and try to heed some of the things that we've been talking about here, just even in terms of, you know, how should I study the languages? There's a lot of benefits to some of the resources that we mentioned there, and trying to learn in that particular way. But always remember that you need to approach the languages as they were meant to be approached, and we want to try to avoid imposing foreign concepts on them. And the ways we can do that is by reading them as ancient or Eastern languages, and also trying to read them in light of insights from linguistics, and there's a lot that we can learn there. So try to pay attention to those things too as you can.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. Bakasha.
Hello, welcome to Constituent Marking with Fred Long on Proof Text. I am Fred Long, and we're looking at 1 Corinthians 14:22. I have been thinking about these verses since I became a believer back in 88. Yeah, I've been a believer since 1988. No, 80, it'd be 84, 85. Yeah, freshman at the University of Illinois. Although, I mean, I was longing for the Lord. I grew up in the church. I had kind of visions and was longing for a relationship. But the moment that he touched me in my heart, I was at University of Illinois. I actually was away from my home church. So it's kind of interesting how the Lord works. Very, very grateful for that moment. And I just began devouring the Word of God. And I became curious, like many believers do right away, in gifts. And I had people urging me to speak in tongues and, ecstatic languages. And I read this passage and read books about it and whatnot. Went to seminary eventually. I've been thinking about these verses for a long time, okay? So let's read this Greek verse and we'll mark it up and I'll kind of explain what's going on here. Osta, that's a connector. Wow, and that's an interesting one. We'll talk about that. Osta receives a box. It's a connector. E glosse is simeon isin u tis pistisusin ala tis apistis. And we'll stop with that, okay? So then, the languages or the tongues are isimeon. So isin is R. That receives a single underline. Isimeon, for or as a sign. Are a sign. It's kind of an idiom. Is, when you have the verb imi with is, it can mean they become one flesh. For example, as an example where the idiom is used, is with imi to mean like is. They become one flesh is an example of where that occurs. So here, tongues are a sign, but I think it's more pointed to that. They are for a sign. Anyway, it's a strong way of saying they're really a sign. So languages or tongues are a sign. And then there's a clarification. Not with respect to tis pistususin, Allah tus apistus. Not for, and here we have a special use of the dative of the dative case. So we use these curly braces here, and that's the big question: is what is the use of the dative case? And then we have an Allah. So Allah is the corrective. So you have an Allah construction, so that so that the languages are as a sign or for a sign, not with respect to or for the sake of those believing. This is a participle, tis pistevusin. It's a dative masculine participle plural, but with respect to or for unbelievers. And now, and this tis apistus is simply an adjective. It's a substantive adjective. This is a substantive participle. So they're both kind of adjectival things that are made into a substantive, and a substantive just means it functions like a noun. This is to the ones believing, and then to the unbelievers. And here, it's interesting. There's been studies on the use of this adjective apistos. It really does construe like pagan unbelievers, like not just unbelievers, but like pagan unbelievers. They're not believing at all. They're living out in their paganism, which, if you weren't a Jew and you weren't a Christian, a follower of Christ, which, could come under the umbrella of Judaism, everyone else was a practicing pagan. Like they generally believed it. I mean, unless you had some intellectual elites who didn't believe in the gods, maybe some Stoics who kind of believed in nature and didn't actually believe in these names of these gods and divinities. But by and large, people, I mean, they worshiped the gods. They were all over, presented on coins, iconography, statuary, inscriptions, paraded around. There's temples all over the place. Well, you get the idea. They're all over. Paul went to Athens and he was saddened, greatly distressed, because of the dozens and dozens of temples and idols that he saw there. So indeed, the average person they were unbelievers. If they're unbelievers, they're kind of committed to paganism. So somehow tongues are a sign not for or with respect to believers, but for unbelievers. Okay, and we'll have to unpack what that means. But Paul says, de, marking new development, e de prophetia. Prophetia is nominative, single underline. A prophetia de marks new development, but here it is in the context of a contrast. So it would be appropriate to translate that but prophesying is not for unbelievers, but for believers. Okay, so here you have a kind of logic expressed, right? So Paul is saying something quite ontological. By ontological, I mean he's getting to the core of definitions. Are a sign, are for a sign. So tongues are for a sign in a certain way, and prophesying are for a sign or are a sign in a certain way, okay? So tongues are for unbelievers, whereas prophesying is for believers, okay? So that's the formula. So tongues, unbelievers, and prophecy for believers. That's the formula. Okay, now what the heck does that mean? That's the big question. This verse has puzzled them. Now, there's this guy by the name of Phillips. He made a translation of the New Testament. He actually has a footnote right here. You have to look this up. It's incredible. He actually changes this logic. Phillips changes it. He has a footnote and says, Paul made a mistake or a copyist made a mistake. I mean, that is radical, because in his mind, he wants to urge that, tongues are a sign for believers, right? Because of Pentecost and this kind of thing. But, so that's a pretty radical step that Phillips took. But here's where we need to understand the culture, and we also need to understand the function of these connectors, osta. So what is osta doing? Typically, osta, at the start here, people learn it beginning Greek maybe as typically a result clause working with an infinitive. You can have result clause with infinitive or with the indicative mood. But osta actually has another use, and I studied this use across the Corinthian epistles and elsewhere. Osta is used with imperatives, or here indicative, to summarize the argument to that point, to bring together, to consolidate important points. Okay, so I have this explained in my article, Paul's Prophesying in Context. I have it probably in my Koine Greek Grammar. I explain this. So this is a consolidation point where Paul is kind of pulling back and he's laying it out definitionally. Tongues are for unbelievers and prophecies for believers. But we should not go the route of Phillips and say that Paul got the logic wrong. Rather, we need to understand the religious context of the word sign. Sign, semeion, is a technical word for like religious manifestation. So I found works of Plato describing mantic possession of the divinity, in which the mind is shut off and the God takes you over. The same thing I found, so Plato's writing in the 400s BC. I found this other guy, his author by the name of Iamblichus, writing in the 3rd century AD, also describing mystery, cult, and religious possession and being possessed by divinities and gods. And in this article, I explain this. I'll summarize it here. He says, there are many different kinds of spirits and possessions, and the signs of these are diverse. He says signs. That's the same word that Paul uses here. And then he starts listing different types of signs of being possessed by a god. And guess what is most prominent? Different voices and different articulations and styles of speech and whatnot. Indeed, in the ancient world, when you were possessed of a divinity, a god or goddess, you spoke differently. And that was the sign that you were possessed of that god. The Delphic oracle indeed spoke in riddles. I think also her voice might have been modulated differently. And so the sign that people were looking for, like the sine qua non, the most essential sign that one might look that you're possessed of some greater reality, is some kind of speech change. And so Paul says that indeed such tongues, such ecstatic speaking, enigmatic, puzzling, strange voices, that is a sign, a religious sign for unbelievers. But that's not the distinctive mark of believers. What is the distinctive mark for believers is prophesying. Now you might say, well, how does that square with the book of Acts? Well, if you look at the tongue speaking event, which by the way is a language speaking event, it is understood in terms of Joel chapter 2, which Peter quotes, which stresses prophesying. So what's happening here, what's happened, I think, in the Corinthian congregation is that people are trying to replicate the Acts event, but in a pagan way, by speaking and mixing ecstatic utterance in their Christian worship, a kind of speaking that is not intelligible. And so Paul is correcting them and redirecting them towards prophesying. And in the previous verse, we saw verse 21, full of authority, says the Lord. Paul issues a prophesying. He models that for them. And so that is what is going on here. So yeah, this verse is summarizing his argument, bringing it to a culmination point, and he's speaking to their culture, their religious expression, which, remember, chapter 12 is framed by them being misled to mute or dumb idols, right? Where people do the speaking for the gods, right? They become possessed in a way that they speak for the gods. And Paul says, actually, what's distinctive of believers is that we prophesy. Now, in the next three verses, we're going to see Paul lays out two scenarios, and this will help support this interpretation that I'm offering, because he's going to show what happens when people speak in languages that are not known. Someone's going to say, you guys are in a frenzy, whereas if someone prophesies, their heart is disclosed, and they indeed say, God is among you. And that's what we want. We want people to recognize what we're saying and to recognize the presence of the Lord, which is intelligible and edifying and praising and blessing of people. All right, we'll look forward to have you listen and watch next time. Take care.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.